The station smelled like recycled air and engine grease, the same as it always did. Calvin Pierce did not mind. He had been working on Nexus Haven for 2 years, and by now the smell felt like home. He was 26 years old, not especially tall, not especially impressive, and his job was to make sure cargo shipments arrived on time and that customs paperwork did not get lost between species. It was not a glamorous job, but it was his, and he was good at it. That morning, however, his job changed without anyone asking him first. He was in the middle of a scheduling dispute between a Velhari freight team and a Draconis supply runner when Colonel Diane Okafor appeared in the doorway of his small office. She was the station commander, a compact woman with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of expression that meant someone somewhere had made a very bad decision. She told him to come with her. Calvin followed her through 3 corridors and 2 security checkpoints before she stopped outside a sealed observation chamber on the lower deck. Through the thick glass, he could see a small creature curled in the far corner of the room. It was roughly the size of a large dog. Its scales were silver blue and caught the light in a way that made them look almost liquid. Its tail was wrapped around its body like a shell, and its tiny claws were pressed flat against the floor. It was also screaming. Not loudly, not from this side of the glass. But the sound monitors on the wall showed the noise levels inside the chamber were enough to make grown Velhari diplomats cover their ears and back out of the room. The hatchling had been screaming, on and off, for 48 hours straight. She would pause for a few minutes, curl tighter, and then start again. Colonel Okafor gave Calvin the short version. The hatchling's name was Zyriel. She was the youngest daughter of Empress Verith of the Draconis sovereignty, placed on Nexus Haven as a symbol of peace between the Draconis and the Velhari. It was a rare and delicate diplomatic gesture. It had been going well, until Zyriel arrived and began making sounds that rattled the ventilation pipes. Every specialist on the station had tried to help. Velhari caretakers, Draconis royal handlers, the station medic, 2 xenobiologists who had flown in from a nearby research post. None of them had lasted more than 20 minutes in the room. One Velhari handler had walked out on the verge of tears. The Draconis specialists were convinced something was medically wrong but could not get close enough to check. The station's mood was tense in the way that only happens when powerful people are quietly panicking. Calvin looked through the glass at the small, screaming creature. He noticed that her eyes, between bursts of noise, were open and scanning the room with a kind of desperate alertness. She was not sick. She was frightened, and no one had figured out how to make her feel safe. Colonel Okafor said, simply, that Calvin was the last option before the situation became an interstellar incident. She did not explain why he was the last option. She just looked at him. Calvin thought about it for about 4 seconds. Then he said he would go in. The door hissed open. The sound hit him immediately, a thin, high note that pressed against his eardrums and made the back of his teeth ache. He stepped inside anyway. He did not approach the hatchling. He did not crouch down or hold out his hands or make any of the soothing noises he had heard other handlers attempt. He walked to the middle of the room, sat down cross-legged on the floor, and stayed there. Zyriel paused mid-scream. Her enormous gold eyes fixed on him. Then she started screaming again. Calvin exhaled slowly. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket, the one he usually forgot to empty, and found a granola bar he had grabbed from the kitchen that morning and never eaten. He turned it over in his hands. Oat and honey. The wrapper crinkled in the sudden relative quiet between one scream and the next. He unwrapped it. The smell reached Zyriel before the food did. It moved through the chamber air slowly, something warm and slightly sweet, like grain and honey pressed together and baked. Zyriel's nostrils flared. Her head lifted, just slightly, from where she had pressed it against the wall. The screaming stopped mid-note, cut off as cleanly as a wire. Through the observation glass, every diplomat, caretaker, and specialist who had gathered in the corridor went completely still. Calvin did not notice any of that. He was looking at the granola bar in his palm, wondering if he should have eaten breakfast instead of skipping it. Then he became aware that the chamber was quiet. He looked up. Zyriel was staring at him. She was still in the corner, but her body was different now. Less coiled. Her tail had loosened from its tight curl. Her gold eyes were fixed on his hand with an expression that Calvin, who had grown up around horses and barn cats and one very opinionated basset hound, recognized immediately. She wanted what he had. He did not move toward her. He had learned a long time ago, from his uncle's ranch back in Kentucky, that you do not walk toward a scared animal. You let it come to you. You make yourself small and boring and patient, and you wait. He held the granola bar flat on his open palm, the way he used to hold apple slices for the horses, and he waited. It took Zyriel about 90 seconds to make up her mind. She uncoiled from the corner slowly, one careful movement at a time, keeping her eyes on him the entire way. When she was close enough, she stretched her neck out and sniffed his hand for a long moment. Her breath was warm and smelled faintly like hot stone. Then she took a tiny bite from the corner of the granola bar. Her expression shifted instantly. Whatever she tasted sent a visible ripple through her body, a small shudder that moved from her snout all the way to the tip of her tail. She looked at his palm, then at him, then at his palm again. She ate the rest of the granola bar in 2 bites. Calvin checked his pockets. He found a small pack of peanut butter crackers, a bag of trail mix with cashews and dried cranberries, and a bruised apple he had been saving to eat at his desk. He had been planning to have a productive afternoon. Instead, he sat on the floor of a sealed diplomatic chamber and fed his lunch to a royal dragon hatchling one piece at a time. In the corridor, the Draconis royal nutritionists had pulled out their analysis equipment and were scanning every molecule they could detect through the glass. The Velhari ambassador, Lord Sethavan, had gone very quiet. Colonel Okafor was leaning close to the monitor with both arms folded and an expression that was hard to read. The analysis took 40 minutes. The conclusion, when it came, moved through the assembled experts like a slow wave of disbelief. Royal dragon hatchlings, in the first weeks of their life, had a narrow but specific nutritional window. Their developing systems required a precise combination of complex natural sugars, slow-release grain compounds, and certain plant-based oils found in tree nuts. The combination was rare. Most worlds that could support life did not produce food that matched it closely enough to matter. Earth food matched it almost perfectly. Not because anyone had planned it. Not because Earth had any prior knowledge of Draconis biology. Simply because of the particular way that oats and honey and peanuts and dried fruit happened to combine into something that a royal dragon's body had been quietly starving for since she arrived on the station. No one had known this was possible, because no human had ever been near a royal dragon hatchling before. Zyriel finished the last cashew from the trail mix, licked Calvin's palm once with a tongue that was warm and rough like sandpaper, and then climbed into his lap. She was heavier than she looked. She turned in a slow circle, the way cats do, and then tucked her head under his arm and exhaled a long, slow breath. She was asleep in under a minute. Calvin sat very still. He looked down at the small silver-blue creature curled against him, her scales rising and falling with each breath, a faint low vibration coming from somewhere in her chest that was not quite a purr but was close enough. He looked up at the glass. He could see the shapes of people on the other side, a lot of people, all watching. He gave a small, uncertain wave. No one waved back. They were all too busy talking at once. Calvin did not move for 4 hours. He told himself at first that it was just 10 minutes. He would sit still for 10 minutes and let the hatchling settle, and then he would carefully shift her to the side and stand up and go back to his cargo scheduling. He had 3 shipment disputes waiting. He had a stack of customs forms from the Velhari freight team that nobody had stamped yet. He had a cold cup of coffee sitting on his desk. 10 minutes passed. Zyriel breathed slowly against his ribs, warm and heavy. He did not move. Another 10 minutes. Then another. The truth was that she was extraordinarily comfortable to sit with. Her scales, up close, were not hard the way he had expected. They had a slight give to them, like something between leather and warm glass. The vibration in her chest was steady and low, not exactly a purr but serving the same purpose. After 2 days of screaming, the silence coming from her was its own kind of sound. He also did not want to wake her up. Not because he was afraid of the noise, though he was not eager to hear it again, but because she had finally found something that worked. She had been frightened and exhausted and no one had been able to help her, and now she was sleeping. It felt wrong to disturb that for the sake of paperwork. So he stayed. Around the 2nd hour, his colleague Priya Nolan appeared at the observation window. Priya was 28, originally from Ohio, and she handled interspecies communications for the station's civilian personnel. She was also Calvin's closest friend on Nexus Haven, which meant she was the first person allowed to see him sitting on the floor of a diplomatic chamber with a baby dragon asleep on his legs without panicking about it. She looked through the glass for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and took a photograph. Calvin saw the flash. He looked up and pointed at her with one finger, the clearest warning he could manage without moving his arms. Priya smiled, looked at the photo, and sent it to the station crew channel. Within 20 minutes, Calvin's phone, sitting silently in his pocket, had received 47 messages. He knew this only because Priya held her own phone up to the glass later and showed him the number. He mouthed something at her that she chose to interpret as thank you. Meanwhile, the situation outside the chamber was evolving rapidly. The Draconis nutritionists had finalized their report and transmitted it to the Sovereignty's home system. The Velhari ambassador had sent 3 increasingly terse communiques to his superiors. The station's diplomatic wing was quietly reorganizing its entire schedule for the week. And Empress Verith of the Draconis Sovereignty had sent a personal message to Nexus Haven. Not to Colonel Okafor. Not to the Velhari delegation. Specifically, directly, and by name, to the human who had fed her daughter. The message was formal, as all Draconis royal correspondence was. But the translation system, which was very good at reading the emotional undertones embedded in Draconis language, flagged a secondary reading beneath the formal words. The flag it used was, relief. A Draconis Empress had felt relief because of something Calvin Pierce had done. Calvin Pierce, who scheduled cargo. Calvin Pierce, who had forgotten a granola bar in his jacket pocket. Colonel Okafor read the translation twice, set it down on her desk, and then sat very quietly for a moment. Lord Sethavon of the Velhari was not quiet. The symbolic value of Zyriel's placement on the station had been specifically about Velhari and Draconis relations. Zyriel bonding to a human, even temporarily, even by accident, disrupted the political geometry he had been carefully constructing for months. He began making calls. None of this reached Calvin until much later. At the 3-hour mark, Priya had slipped a handwritten note under the chamber door that said, "You are causing a diplomatic situation." At the 4-hour mark, she slid another one under that said, "Also Zyriel is trending on 3 alien communication networks." The photo Colonel Okafor authorized for release. Calvin read both notes without changing expression. Then Zyriel shifted in his lap, let out a small sound like a kettle just starting to heat, and resettled. He folded the notes and put them in his pocket. He had one question when Colonel Okafor finally came to the door to debrief him. He asked it before she could say anything else. He asked if Zyriel was going to be okay. Okafor looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. The hatchling was stable, her vitals were better than they had been since she arrived, and the Draconis medical team believed the nutritional correction had already begun. Calvin nodded. He stood up carefully, moved Zyriel to a cushioned surface the handlers had brought in, and picked up his phone. 47 messages had become 112. He put the phone back in his pocket and went to find the station kitchen, because he needed to know what else they had that a growing dragon might eat. The next 2 weeks were the busiest of Calvin's life, and most of it had nothing to do with cargo scheduling. Earth's government, which had previously shown limited interest in Nexus Haven, was suddenly very interested. Requests arrived for human nutritionists, agricultural specialists, xenobiologists, and food scientists. The station's small human crew found themselves receiving briefings, attending diplomatic sessions, and answering questions they had never expected anyone to ask them. Chief Engineer Lou Baxter, a broad-shouldered man from New Mexico who had been keeping the station's engines running for 6 years and preferred it when no one talked to him, was pulled into 3 separate meetings about Earth soil composition. He sat through all of them with the patient expression of someone who understood that complaining would only make things take longer. Medic Grace Solano, who was from Florida and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had seen most things go sideways at least once, handled the medical briefings with the Draconis team. She learned more about Draconis hatchling physiology in 4 days than had been published in any xenobiology journal, because the Draconis specialists were, for the first time, genuinely motivated to share. Priya Nolan managed communications. She was very good at it. She also kept a running count of how many times per day someone from a different species used the phrase "the human with the food" when referring to Calvin, which reached 31 on the 3rd day and stopped being funny somewhere around 47. Calvin spent most of his time with Zyriel. She was growing fast. Royal dragon hatchlings, the Draconis handlers explained, developed rapidly once their basic needs were met. Each morning Calvin arrived with food from the station kitchen, items he had worked out with the cook, a woman named Bernadette who had initially been skeptical but was now deeply invested in the project. Oatmeal with honey, warm mashed sweet potato, sliced apples, dried mango, which Zyriel would smell from across the room and immediately begin moving toward at speed. The Draconis handlers watched everything he did and took careful notes. They were very professional about it, but Calvin could tell they found his methods confusing. He did not use formal bonding protocols. He did not speak to Zyriel in Draconis, which he did not know. He did not maintain the careful formal posture that Draconis royalty required of attendants. He talked to her about ordinary things, about the weather back in Kentucky and how his old truck had broken down on the highway 3 times in the same year and how baseball had a particular rhythm to it that made it good for long afternoons. He was not sure how much she understood. But her ears, small curved things that sat flat against her skull when she was nervous, came up and forward when he talked. She watched his face. She was also growing. By the end of the first week she was bigger than a German shepherd. By the start of the second she had to duck slightly to get through the chamber door. Her silver-blue scales were changing too. The Draconis handlers noticed it first, a faint edging of gold appearing along the ridge of each scale, catching the light when she moved. They came to Calvin to explain what it meant, all 3 of them, with the gravity of people delivering important news. Gold edging on a royal hatchling scales indicated healthy royal development, they said. It appeared when a hatchling was thriving, when their body was strong and their mind was settled. It had not been seen this early in a hatchling in recorded Draconis history. They were not entirely sure what to make of it appearing here, in this station, because of oatmeal and dried fruit and a human who talked about baseball. Calvin looked at Zyriel. Zyriel looked back at him with gold eyes over a face that was getting more angular by the day, the soft roundness of infancy giving way to something that would eventually be very grand. He asked if the gold was a good thing. The handlers said yes. Very much so. Calvin said good, and gave Zyriel a piece of dried mango. Not everyone was pleased with how things were developing. Lord Sethavan had begun a quiet campaign among diplomatic channels, spreading the idea that the human presence near Zyriel was not coincidence but calculation. That Earth had positioned Calvin deliberately. That the bonding was a political move, not a simple accident of pocket snacks. Priya heard the whispers first. She told Calvin over dinner in the station canteen, watching his face. Calvin ate his soup. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said that Zyriel was eating well, sleeping through the night, and had started doing something that the Draconis team described as play, which involved batting things off surfaces and looking at Calvin as though he was responsible for gravity. He said that Lord Sethavan could think whatever he liked. Priya smiled into her bowl. Lou Baxter, who was sitting across the table and had not been invited into the conversation, said that in his experience, the people who spent the most time worrying about other people's motives were usually the ones with the most motives of their own. No one disagreed with that. Empress Vareth of the Draconis sovereignty arrived on a Tuesday. The docking bay was not built for her. The station's engineers had done their best on short notice, opening 2 cargo bays and removing every non-essential wall between them, but Vareth still had to angle her head slightly to clear the entrance. She was 40 meters long, deep crimson with edges of black, and when she moved through the station corridors the floor vibrated with each step in a way that was felt more than heard. Every important person on Nexus Haven had prepared for her arrival. Lord Sethavan had his counter-arguments arranged in careful order. The Velhari diplomatic team had rehearsed their formal greetings. Colonel Okafor had reviewed the security protocols 3 times and positioned her people with quiet precision. Priya had printed contingency plans in 3 colors. Lou Baxter had checked every structural support in the corridors Vareth would walk through and declared them adequate, with a margin of doubt he kept to himself. Calvin had made oatmeal. He was in the small side room where he spent his mornings with Zyriel, sitting on the floor because the chairs were now too small to share comfortably with a dragon who was approaching the size of a draft horse. Zyriel was draped across his legs in the way she had been doing since she was small enough to fit in his lap, apparently unconcerned that she now weighed considerably more. Calvin had a mug of coffee in one hand and was reading through a cargo report on his tablet with the focused expression of someone who had decided that normal life would continue regardless of circumstances. He heard the vibration before he heard anything else. Then the doorway darkened. He looked up. Empress Verith filled the frame entirely. Up close she was immense in a way that photographs had not captured, not just large but present, the kind of creature that changed the feeling of a room simply by being in it. Her eyes were deep amber, older than anything Calvin had encountered in his 26 years, and they moved from him to her daughter and back again with an attention that was completely focused. Calvin set down his tablet and started to get up carefully, trying not to disturb Zyriel. Zyriel woke up anyway. She raised her head, saw her mother, and made a sound that was somewhere between a chirp and a low rumble. She did not scramble up. She did not cry. She simply looked at Verith with the calm, settled eyes of an animal that felt safe where it was. Calvin stood. He did not know the proper formal address for a female Draconis ruler. He had looked it up twice and forgotten it twice. He said "sir," because it was the first word that came out, and then immediately thought that was probably wrong. Verith did not correct him. She studied him for a long time. Then she looked at Zyriel again. The gold edging on Zyriel's scales caught the light as she breathed. It had spread over the past 2 weeks, moving from the ridge of each scale outward, so that now when she moved she flickered with it. The Draconis handlers had told Calvin it was remarkable. Standing in the doorway, Verith looked at her daughter's scales, and something in her enormous amber eyes shifted in a way that Calvin could not name but understood anyway. Verith spoke. The translation matrix in the wall rendered her words in a flat, even voice that did not carry any of the weight behind them, but the weight was there. She said, "You did not try to be important to her. You simply stayed." Calvin did not have a good answer for that. It had not felt like a decision. He had just sat down. He nodded. Verith turned. Behind her, filling the corridor, were the diplomats and handlers and advisors who had been following at a careful distance. Lord Sethavon was among them, with his prepared arguments and his careful expression. Verith addressed them all. Her voice, even translated, filled the corridor without effort. She said that the Draconis sovereignty was extending formal allied recognition to the human species. Not as a client civilization. Not as a curiosity or a useful discovery. As an ally, with full reciprocal standing and the rights that came with it. She said this clearly and without pause, in the tone of someone who had already decided and was now simply informing the room. She then addressed Lord Sethavon specifically. She said that any further diplomatic maneuvering intended to diminish or complicate the relationship between the sovereignty and the human people would be treated as a direct affront to the royal house, and that she trusted he understood what that meant. Lord Sethavon said that he understood. Then Verith did something that made every Draconis handler in the corridor go very still. She lowered her head, slowly, and rested it for a moment on the floor just inside the doorway, near where Calvin was standing. It was a brief gesture, only a few seconds. The handlers would spend a long time afterward explaining to anyone who asked that this was a form of gratitude offered by Draconis royalty so rarely that most of them had only read about it. It had not been extended to an outsider species in any record any of them could find. Calvin looked at the enormous crimson head resting near his feet. He looked at Zyriel, who was watching with calm gold eyes. He looked at the corridor full of diplomats who were all holding very still. He cleared his throat. He said he would put in a formal supply request for a regular shipment of granola bars, dried mango, and peanut butter crackers, and that he would make sure it was routed through the proper customs channels so nobody had to deal with the paperwork twice. Colonel Okafor, standing at the back of the corridor, started laughing. It was a real laugh, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and there is nothing to be done about it. She had to lean against the wall. Priya covered her mouth. Lou Baxter looked at the ceiling. Zyriel opened one gold eye, decided everything was fine, and went back to sleep. The galaxy, slowly and in its own complicated way, began to take notice of the humans.